going to go to the presentation from Jeremy Roth-Kushel, another guy with Jewish heritage he expresses in other ways than insane tribalism and support for Israel. In fact, Jeremy Roth-Kushel is one of the great truth tellers of our time, just like you, Alan, and other members of our panel, actually. Jeremy, with We Are Change Los Angeles, was involved in confrontations of many important people, getting in their faces and telling them truths, often 9/11 related truths, and making videos that would go viral on the internet. And then Jeremy made another kind of history by being maybe the first person ever arrested for asking a question during a library Q&A at the Kansas City Public Library, mentioning your name, Alan Zabrowski's name, that is, and getting himself dragged off by militarized trained Israel off-duty police operating as security at that public library. Well, Jeremy is going to be, he's also, I should mention, he's a co-host with me at False Flag Weekly News alongside Dr. Anthony Hall, who's now in an academic freedom battle up at the University of Lethbridge. Jeremy has done a lot of interesting research on Talpiot, this Israeli high-tech program that may be a part of this masterful Zionist strategy that Alan Zabrowski was just talking about. So let's hear it from the man himself. Welcome, Jeremy Roth-Kushel. Good to have you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I definitely am very appreciative and feel privileged to be on this panel with my fellow co-panelists who have done very important public work that I appreciate very much. And as per previous Dr. Zabrowski saying maybe I should be careful about being dragged off after his presentation, I had to go and change my shirt because I sort of sweated out my previous one because it's pretty hot here in the what I would call the radical middle of America. And that's both politically and geographically. And while I was changing my shirt, I took a look out the window and I saw no black vans approaching, not yet, or maybe white van. Maybe I should be looking for white vans. But before I start, I want to say that I actually believe that our situation might be both worse than Dr. Zabrowski says, and also potentially better in terms of the possibilities. So in working into that, though, I want to take a step back and identify myself as a Jewish American patriot of conscience. In so doing, I mean to say that politically, I'm an American. My background in terms of family, certain aspects of culture, some religious upbringing is Jewish. I'm also from Los Angeles, so I have a little Mexican influence in there from my mom's side, from the Tarahumara Indians of northern Mexico, who are known for making violins and running long distances. And I bring that up to say that the facts that I want to bring to our attention here are meant for the idea of truth force, satyagraha, the healing power of truth. And that's on behalf of all of the people of the planet. Politically, I speak as an American. Culturally, in some background, I speak in some ways as on behalf of Jewish people. But intellectually and spiritually, I speak for humanity, both our humanity inside and our humanity abroad that is being so violently attacked at this point. So let me get into this. This is a very wide-ranging issue that has a lot of details that I don't have the full coherent grasp on all of them. But the overarching view is very, very coherent, I believe, at this point. And that is that there is a long-term Israeli military intelligence strategy to dominate the planet. And in the current version of it is through the cyber world, through dominating the world's online technology, databases, backdoors, critical infrastructure, communications. And so I want to just briefly map out some of the background of this by basically, because what I'm saying ultimately is that there is a global conspiracy of what we might call, or what I might call, the deep the Jewish deep state. And by saying the Jewish deep state, I mean to talk about a global power network that in modern day in Israeli intelligence would be usually termed as Zionim, global helpers, mainly Jewish, all Zionist, all willing to do things to help the power of the Israeli state. But then we could also talk about the deep Jewish state. Israel defines itself as the Jewish state. And what we know about the idea of the deep state is that it represents the intersection of institutional state power, national so-called security power, and the underworld, the black economy, the mob economy. And so in both these places, both the deep Jewish state, represented by Israeli military intelligence, long-term technical intelligence in Israel, and the Jewish deep state, meaning the even longer-term global Jewish power networks that helped bring the Jewish state into existence, we see a long-term planning operation that is replete with conspiratorial intent and very often deceptive and violent. And increasingly, this I in a short term, I I would call this, and actually I get this term from Brendan O'Connell, who's the very sharp Australian activist who brought this concept of Talpiot to my attention. He calls it the biggest national security breach or biggest security breach in history. And I think he's correct about that. And for at least the last 150 years, I believe that this represents in many ways the largest US security breach, but increasingly in the 21st century and onwards, it actually represents a global security breach of increasingly negative proportions. So now I'm going to flip into some notes so you can follow me as I proceed. And I'm going to run through a lot of facts because I want to bring in some of the deep background to understanding our context here. Because in many ways, I agree with Dr. Sobrowski in terms of making connections, rethinking how we might approach September 11th. And in terms of September 11th, I believe that September 11th remains both the Achilles heel of those forces that we need to lawfully apprehend. And I also believe it represents the philosopher's stone to understand this larger context. So I guess my disagreement in many ways might be that from as we saw aspects of the truth movement, and I appreciate very much Gilad Atzmon's attention to the complexity of the truth. And once you see truth movements, you see control. And so what we've seen is some movement, some organic, authentic movement in the midst of this control, from what happened to who did it. And now I would say it's essential that we make the connection to why it was done. And we know a lot of the background in terms of the greater Israel plan, Oded Yinon. We know about the expansion of military bases. We know of Ray McGovern's OIL, oil. Now we know from the Gary Vogel book about oil that the oil agenda was actually for Israel, and then I being for Israel, and then L for logistics, meaning long-term military logistics in that part of the world. But I also think that there's a part of the 9/11 agenda, the why, that has not been fully uncovered, and I believe that's actually the focus of this presentation. That a lot of it had to do. We've seen this idea of the ramping up of cyber surveillance, cyber security, aspects of the police state here in the so-called homeland. But I would actually assert that that might have been the biggest long-term reason an Israeli military intelligence incentive for September 11th was to supercharge their potential cyber domination of the planet in a corporatist economic fashion. And so we'll get into that. So Talpiot in Unit A200, the global cyber agenda for kill switch domination. So Talpiot, what is Talpiot? Talpiot was a program that was set into motion after the Israelis suffered heavy losses in the wake of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Some professors, a psychologist, approached the Israeli Air Force, and then also Rafi Eitan, the infamous Israeli intelligence leader, that they thought that Israel needed to think longer term. So what it is, the Talpiot program essentially, and in many ways, we're actually using the idea of Talpiot, I would say, as a shorthand for a much larger agenda that is even precedes the actual program itself. But Talpiot itself, you can imagine it as a special forces combined with engineering training program for the idea of managing strategic tech domination by Israeli military intelligence. So the recruits, there are very few. There's just dozens a year. They do 3 years, a little bit more than 3 years in physics, math, or computer science, while simultaneously field training across all IDF branches. And then after that, they do 6 years of service in the IDF. And after that, about a third of the Talpiot remain in the Israeli military over the long term. About a third go back into the academic sector, both in Israel and abroad. A lot in the United States of America, actually. And then a third of them pursue the corporate route, the business route. Unit 8200 is the Israeli NSA. It's been around longer than the Talpiot program. It was formed in the early 50s through way of old US equipment, I believe. And it represents now the engineering force and the source for Israeli cyber power worldwide. In the book recently published by Ronen Bergman, Rise and Kill First, The Secret History of Israel's Targeted Assassinations, and that title comes from a Talmudic assertion about killing before you're killed. On page 597, it talks about how Meir Dagon's Mossad, who's responsible for human intelligence, was working with Aharon Zevi Farkash's Amman, that's the Israeli military intelligence. He was also the previous head of Unit 8200, signals intelligence, to combine forces into what they began to call Hugint. So the combination of human intelligence and signals intelligence. And one, Yossi Cohen, I believe his name is, he's actually the current head of the Mossad. He was critical to all of this. And one of the biggest things that we've seen produced by Unit 8200 Israeli military intelligence that we all have heard about is Stuxnet. And I believe that Stuxnet in many ways is a perfect example of this idea of Hugint, or Hogint, I don't know how to exactly say it, but human intelligence combined with signals intelligence, which I believe is also at the heart of what the Talpiot program represents long term. In that, we see the idea of an industrial scale super virus that was programmed by collaboration between the NSA and Unit 8200, actually put on a USB smart drive, I believe, and then found ways through assets or agents on the ground in Iran to find its way onto the computers in Iran's nuclear program. It's interesting too to note that the USB drive comes out of the bowels of Israeli technology. So I think this is a perfect example of it. So the current Talpiot Unit 8200 power is the result of the long-term planning of Israeli technical intelligence, which is known as LACOM, which was really formed by Shimon Peres back in the 50s in many ways. It was called the Bureau of Science Liaison. So in the age of the ascent of cyber warfare, should we actually be talking about things like technological intelligence or cyber intelligence? So this, if you get anything from my talk, this is what I want you to get, is straight from the mouth of the, quote, Prime Minister Netanyahu. This is what he said just a few months ago. And I call him Prime Minister. The thousands of Israelis call him Prime Minister. So I believe it would probably be in the realm of new anti Semitism if I didn't call him Prime Minister Netanyahu. So a few months ago, Netanyahu was on the Fox News with Mark Levin, and he laid out the purpose of this long-term planning supercharged by the Talpiot program when he said, quote, "We not only do it for us, we share it with dozens of countries. We've prevented dozens of terrorist attacks, major terrorist attacks. So when you take security interest and intelligence, that countries have to protect themselves against terrorism, and that's pretty much all countries, and you take the needs for technological, the innovation that is driving the world right now, both of them are present in Israel, and so everybody wants them. And that gives me the third thing, which is this massive flourishing of Israel's diplomatic relations with just about every country in the world. Not all. We're not big on North Korea, and not too big on Iran, but just about everyone else. And so this is the triangle. It's economic power, security power, gives you diplomatic power. That will take a few years to transit itself into the votes of this archaic body called a General Assembly of the United Nations or some of the other bodies. It'll take a while until they get the news, but it's happening all over the world. So Israel has never been stronger militarily, economically, diplomatically, and it's a very deliberate policy, and it begins with economics. He then more recently was quoted in a Times of Israel article titled "How Quantum Physics Can Make Israel More Secure," as saying, "I will soon declare the technological scientific program to strengthen Israel's security," Netanyahu told science ministers and delegations from 25 countries at a convention in Israel. Quote, "Among other things, the revolutionary program will advance Israel in quantum technology. That field is vital for Israel's intelligence." So quantum, putting aside the whole question of the scientific backing of quantum, I would ask people to actually look into the Iranian-born scientist Keshe, Keshe, for alternative explanations of deep physics. But what the technology behind quantum computing actually is clearly up and coming. Google is starting to announce its apparent cyber domination of quantum. And what you see is just two major, as far as I can see, public quantum computing centers in the United States. The one I'm aware of is at USC in Southern California, and it's a combination of USC with Lockheed Martin, and an Israeli is at the helm. So back to 1979 to when this all started. This is when there were the harbingers of 9/11, the global war on terror, agents sent out to the world, and the beginning of Talpiot. The Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism, organized by then a younger Netanyahu. This was, of course, the architecture for the modern war on terror, and the who's who of some of the national security so-called elite of UK, the US, were all there in the Jerusalem Conference. It was also the year that the father of Israeli intelligence, Issa Harel, foretold the journalist Michael Evans, "My last question was, would terrorism ever come to America?" And Harel said, quote, "You have the power to fight it," he said, "but not the will. They have the will, but not the power. All of that will change in time. Yes, I fear it will come to New York and your tallest building, which is a symbol of your fertility," unquote. 79 was also the year that Shaul Eisenberg, Mossad, founder of Beit Asia and the Israel Corp, sponsored a flight of Israeli military high level for the first time, and did it very covertly to China. And Shaul Eisenberg's important figure. People should go look into him. He was also a key figure in the Jewish community in Japan. Basically, Israeli intelligence man for the Far East. And so this was sensitive both for Israel and for the Chinese, and so it was kept very, very secret. And so you can imagine that the Israelis, as they were still deeply sucking at the U.S. teat, did not want to spook their U.S. sponsors too badly. 79 was also the year that one Yosef Bodansky, who was also LACOM, Israeli Technical Intelligence, had arrived in the USA. Ultimately, he works then at JINSA. He goes from editing the Israeli Air Force's journal to editing the JINSA, Jewish Institute for National Security of America, I think it's called now, their journal. And then he ultimately makes his way into the government with help of basically Israeli moles and creates a center called the Technology Transfer Center. And 79 is the year the Talpiot program actually begins, the first class. So I don't have time to really go through all of this carefully, but this is the deep background that I would just ask people to go look at, that there's this intelligence that Netanyahu talks about actually precedes the formation of Israel. I would say that it goes all the way back to things like the City of London, Rothschilds, in its progress into Amman and Lakam. So in the 1800s, you have the birth of the B'nai B'rith, in conjunction with Scottish Rite Freemasonry, and the Knights of the Golden Circle were not only critical to the Confederate intelligence and rats, sort of rat lines from the middle of America up into Montreal, but it has been said that they helped form the Ku Klux Klan. So these are the kind of facts that I believe might, in multicultural, multiracial modern America, that the people who send the ADL, which is the birth child of the B'nai B'rith, to focus on race relations at Starbucks, people should hear about this. I think both African Americans and Jewish Americans might want to hear the allegation that the ADL of B'nai B'rith, that its parent organization, the B'nai B'rith, might be the father of the Ku Klux Klan. So certain figures to look into: Simon Wolf, Judah Benjamin, and Albert Pike. Later on, after the turn of the 20th century, you see similar characters, including Simon Wolf, who had been the head of the B'nai B'rith. People like Bernard Baruch, Edward House, Louis Brandeis, Felix Frankfurter, the Supreme Court justices who have been publicly outed in many ways by Alison Weir as the Parushim, the secret Zionist society, were orchestrating for not only the potential Jewish occupation of Palestine, but also the engagement in World War I by the United States in conjunction with an agreement with their Rothschild sponsors in the City of London. But then you also have the UK, which was also a spook's nest. There's the notorious Kim Philby. A lot is made of him as a Soviet spy. It's come out recently that he was a Zionist mole and played a key role in apparently distracting, putting UK and MI6, I believe, on a fool's errand in order to set up the King David Hotel bombing for the Zionists. Victor Rothschild, who threw Kim Philby under the bus after he was told about Kim Philby writing 2 pro-Arab journal articles by Flora Solomon, then Benenson, who actually was the daughter of a Rothschild related Russian Jewish gold broker. Victor Rothschild, turns out that he was also apparently a Soviet mole. Was he also a Zionist mole? Very likely. So there you have that. And then moving to the US, we have the notorious James Angleton, who was basically the long-term solid asset of Israel, even before it was founded, it looks like. And this 56 Egypt invasion by Israel, the UK, and France, Angleton was in the White House trying to convince the president that it wasn't going to happen, and he was actually confronted by a CIA analyst and said that he was already co-opted, and of course he was proven to not be wrong but probably be dissembling. But also Angleton was the key player in JFK, in the JFK assassination on the US side, that had to do a lot in terms of its intention about Dimona, the creation of the Israeli nuclear weapons program, NUMEC, the Apollo plant in Pennsylvania. Angleton, as head of counterintelligence, obviously looked the other way as Rafi Eitan, high-level Israeli intelligence, came into the country, and I'm pretty obviously trucked and bartered American nuclear resources to help Israel build its bombs. And then Angleton was also there at the USS Liberty, and in terms of the 6-Day War in 1967, there even the elements of NSA didn't know how the USS Liberty got there. State Department didn't know. The White House apparently didn't know. I don't know if that's true, but the head of State Department intelligence blatantly said, "I'll bet Angleton was the one who put the USS Liberty there. He definitely helped in the cover-up. And then running through this very quickly, the ADL from its very inception apparently has been involved in spying. They spied on the Nation of Islam looking for anti-Semitism. Instead, they found anti-racism, which included anti-Jewish supremacism. So they kept some agents in there. They spied on Martin Luther King Jr. That was outed by Hochschild, I think his name was, a former ADL official in the 90s. All the way through Jonathan Pollard, the head of the ADL at that time, Kenneth Bjalkin, who had formerly been the head of every major Jewish power organization you can think of, including the B'nai B'rith internationally, was in place to try to run the cover-up, ran to Israel right after Pollard was arrested, and all the way into the modern era of the well-known 80s and 90s, probably ongoing spying of the ADL on Palestinian solidarity activists, even including U.S. senators, and then also anti-apartheid South Africa activists. Jinsa that I mentioned before has also been at the core of this spy's nest, from Richard Pearl and the previously mentioned Joseph Bodansky to the more modern John Bolton and Michael Makovsky, who's the current head, who is outed by Gary Vogler in his recent book. By the way, Go Jayhawks, that was put out here by KU Press. I'm more into intellectual successes rather than hoops, but Go Jayhawks. Michael Makovsky was outed by Gary Vogler in his book as a very likely agent of Israeli intelligence, maybe an officer. He doesn't have it on his biography that you can find, but Vogler says that Makovsky, who was born in the U.S., born in St. Louis, actually over here in Missouri, went to Israel to be in the Foreign Service for many, many years in the 80s, I believe. And Vogler says 98% of Israeli Foreign Service is Israeli intelligence. So that puts Michael Makovsky, who was also at the head of the Pentagon's oil delegation and operations, as basically being in charge of Israeli intelligence. And then moving quickly through the Jonathan Pollard incidents, there was a Mr. X group, Mr. X that was left in place because Pollard was passing the Israelis documents that the Israelis already had the numbers on. So someone very high level at the Pentagon, very likely, or at some level in the U.S. national security apparatus, had already given them what to look for. And so that Mr. X remained in place. But similar to the idea of Mega, when Israeli intelligence was heard by NSA in the late 90s and during the Clinton administration, to have someone called Mega on the inside, Mega probably turned out to be more than just an individual and turned out to be a group, just like Mr. X. Mr. X turned out to be something like an Israeli-Soviet long-term spy nest that apparently involves people like Pollard, Albert Wohlstetter, Shabtai Kalmanovich, who was actually outed as a Soviet agent in Israel, Harold Katz, who was the apparent sort of financial manager of this whole situation through the idea of the BIRD, which was the binational U.S.-Israeli binational industrial research and development program that was set up and apparently run by Israelis. So I don't know what the U.S. was getting out of it. And then ultimately even into such deep technology as people like Ben Rich, who I heard CIA pilot John Lear identify as a Mossad, from a prominent Jewish Filipino family. His son, Michael Rich, is currently head of the RAND Corporation, which is another piece of this apparent mole's nest, which people have asserted includes the Yoda of the long-term U.S. national security set involving RAND, called Andrew Marshall. And then the mega group finally turned out to have been actually a group of Zionist Jewish billionaires that included the Bronfmans, whose daughters now are implicated in the NXIVM blackmail sex trafficking scandal, having funded it to $150 million. Les Wexner, who was basically the father sponsor of one Jeffrey Epstein, the epicenter of blackmail operations for Mossad and likely for aspects of CIA and FBI, having actually given Jeffrey Epstein his townhouse with cameras already installed, apparently. And then Michael Steinhardt, the sort of current dean of the Birthright Israel program. Okay, so I'm going to rush through this. I'm not going to really discuss this too much. I don't think I have too much time left here. But this idea of security that Netanyahu mentioned as being part of this long-term operation, I would say security grows out of a mushroom cloud in terms of this long-term Jewish intelligence operation. Samson Option Point 1 was the sort of 100 years ago operations of the people like the Parushim and the Simon Wolf, subterfuge, rumors of warmongering and bombs, which included, of course, the Jerusalem hotel bomb, but also included letter bombs to multiple UK officials, but also to President Truman, which is a fact that I put on the record at the Kansas City Public Library 2 years ago before I brought up Alan Sabrowski's name and got grabbed by a fusion center Met Israeli trained partisan paid security so-called guys. So Samson Option 1.0 was, I would say, the early spying, the false flag assassinations of the 60s, including both of the Kennedys. Look at Laurent Guyonneau's work on that, and the macro nuclear threat as Israel went nuclear. And I forgot to mention that Shimon Peres is part of the way that he got the French to help build Dimona in the first place was he promised Israeli involvement in that 56 invasion of Egypt. And so in many ways, Shimon Peres is the real father of the Israeli nuclear program. And then Samson Option 2.0, more recently from basically the Jerusalem conference on, we're talking about this technology transfer that included this Pollard scandal that in many ways was a technology transfer not just to Israel, but to the Soviet Union in a big way. But also then the rise of false flag terrorism. We see the 93 World Trade Center bombing, even elements of the OKC bombing. Look at Michael Collins Piper's work on the OKC bombing in terms of Israeli involvement in that. And then I would assert the usage of tactical micro nukes in terrorist attacks around the world, which apparently included Lower Manhattan on September 11th, and look at the work of Joe Vials, the Australian deceased journalist, about the Bali bombing. And then finally, Samson Option 3.0. This is the contemporary Samson option. It includes mass MK Ultra. The CONOPS, it's a term that I've coined as sort of an alternative to PSYOPs, because the IDF has a section or a unit called the Unit for Consciousness Operations. And so I think it's a larger perspective of the kind of psychological warfare that's being waged on us in the age of Cambridge Analytica, Black Cube Intelligence, Wikistrat, Psi Group, all of these very current groups. But it's also when the Talpiot and Unit 8200 went global, and Netanyahu can then stand up at AIPAC and basically imply the power of kill switch diplomacy. Okay, I'm going to go a few more minutes if that's okay. Economics, fire up the firms with a little 9/11. So I'm going to read a quote from Netanyahu at this year's AIPAC that lays this out. Quote, "Now there are new industries. Israel is literally, how can I say this? Israel is literally driving the world. I'm talking about autonomous vehicles. Israel is a world leader in autonomous vehicles. 500 tech companies that sprang up almost instantaneously. And one of them, Mobileye, up there on the left, was just sold to Intel for the paltry sum of $15 billion. But the interesting thing is that Intel said to them, quote, 'Here are the keys to our 30 worldwide autonomous vehicle businesses. You run it,' unquote. Israel technology is driving the world. And one last industry, there are many more, but one more that you're all familiar with. You have bank accounts. You should, okay? Well, you don't want anyone hacking into them, right? Or into your cars or into the planes you ride. You need cybersecurity. Everybody needs cyber. Israel has become a world leader in cybersecurity. So what percentage do we get of the world global investment in cybersecurity, in private investment in cybersecurity? We're 1/10 of 1% of the world's population, and we get a whopping 20% of global private investment in cyber. We're punching 200 times above our weight. Not 2 times, not 10 times, not 100 times, 200 times above our weight. That's very strong, Netanyahu said. And so I would say that looking into the second to last chapter in Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, it was called Losing the Peace Incentive, Israel as Warning. And it laid out basically that the Israeli economy was on the verge of collapse, similar in certain ways to the way that there was the dot-com problems in the US, but this was much more pervasive. And before September 11th, the Israeli government propped up its cyber and switched it fully into security and counterterrorism. And then a few months later, September 11th, and Israel became the shopping mall to the world. In James Banford's book about the Shadow Factory, about the NSA, he talks about 2 key Israeli companies that were brought in post September 11th to wiretap the entire country. One is Naris, which was co-founded by a Talpiot graduate, Maurice Nacht, who was actually recruited out of a global Jewish educational group called ORT. And then also Verint, which has a very interesting background and which has apparently been brought in all across the world, not only to wiretap so-called the American people, but also has been brought deeply into the heart of Chinese communications, Mexico, Southeast Asia, all around the world. Israeli intelligence is in the back door there. So that I think that there's some element of proof that the Israelis were not only helped organize September 11th in a large way, but we're preparing to take advantage of it in terms of this supercharger of their cyber economy, where now they're punching 200 times above their weight. And people can go look into things that the research people like Christopher Bolin, who's written articles like, is MITRE the Trojan horse of 9/11, or did Mossad deceive the US military on 9/11? So PTEC and MITRE in the run up to September 11th were in the basement of the FAA. They were apparently put that technology, which looks to have been Trojan horsed by Israeli military intelligence by way of an American scion in Massachusetts, the son and grandson of high-level B'nai B'rith Judeo-Freemasons, Goffman, I believe his name is, was put into virtually all of the U.S. government's computers in the run-up to September 11th. And then one last thing on that point was the brothers Yaron, Amit Yaron, who was ultimately put in charge of the CIA's investment unit in QTEL after 9/11, was already the head of cyber consultancy and security for the Pentagon in the run-up to September 11th. Does any of this make actual loyal U.S. military, both veterans and currently serving, angry? Let alone all of the technology transfer that Israel has done to China and Russia all around the world? Man, it makes me angry as a Jewish American. So, and then finishing up here, the companies they'll look into are Verint, Naris, NICE, basically a lock on a lot of the police databases, technology around the country. Checkpoint, as Allison Weir pointed out yesterday, the Jewish Voices for Peace leader, Rebecca Vilkomerson, her husband works at Checkpoint. That's a Talpiot company. Amdocs, they basically were doing all of the billing for American communications prior to 9/11. Guardium, connected to the PTEC and MITRE cutout over there in Massachusetts. FST, that's related back to the former head of Israeli military intelligence in Unit 8200, Aharon Farkash, Zevi Farkash. I believe it's possible. Before I got grabbed after saying the word Sabrowski in an American public library, I might believe I and my friend Greg McCarran might have been subjected to an invisible Israeli military intelligence potentially with the biometrics run by this company FST. look into that. The very day after my arrest, FST and the Jewish communities of North America put out a press release saying that FST was the preferred identity management contractor for all North American Jewish communities. Zen Technology, they manage what's it called? PSP, the PHP, the computer code. I'm not much of a cyber guy myself, but almost all, Facebook, I believe, is programmed on PHP. It was originally developed by a European, and then quickly it was taken over by an Israeli company, Zen Technologies, and is managed by them to this day. Go look at the RAD group. A single company, a single group, basically created a lot of the technology around the world in terms of the back ends of things like VoIP systems. Tower Jazz Semiconductors, Mobileye, as mentioned before, M Systems, which is where I believe the USB stick came out of, and then the cutout aspects of P-Tech and MITRE. So as I said before, USB memory sticks are products of the deep bowels of Israeli military intelligence. PHP firewalls, Intel's ARC processor, quantum optics. Increasingly, go look at the Weizmann Institute and the Talpiot graduates who are deeply involved in that. There, Stuxnet, self-driving cars, in-motion identity management, biometrics, VoIP, etc. The institutions to look at are the Technion, which, by the way, is now about to have a campus in Manhattan by way of Bloomberg. They're combining forces with Cornell to create a campus there. Hebrew University is the home university of Talpiot. The Weizmann Institute, they're deep in the quantum optics, and then Bar-Ilan University. So diplomacy, kill switch diplomacy, the civilian carrot and the cyber stick. And so this sort of wraps up the Netanyahu's own words, basically in a rollout of what all of this power is going to result in. And this is very recent that he's sort of uncloaking in many ways, I would say. So this is at APAC 2018. He says, quote, "Now here's how the dots connect. Because we have this tremendous capacity for security and intelligence, and because we have this tremendous capacity for civilian technology, for making the lives of people richer, safer, more productive, many countries are coming to Israel because they want to share with us these benefits. And that creates the third great change, which is a flourishing of Israel's diplomatic relations around the world. You know, when I joined the Foreign Service 105 years ago as the DCM to the city, Washington, the number 2 in our embassy, I think we had about 80 to 90 countries with whom we had diplomatic relations. Now the number is 160, and there are very few countries left. We went to Argentina, to Colombia, to Mexico, and they say, come back, come back. We want more. That is changing. All these countries are coming to us. India, China, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, all of them, Azerbaijan, Muslim countries. First time I visited Australia, tremendous, far away though. So we're coloring the world blue. And you know what? The numbers. You remember people talking about Israel's isolation? Pretty soon, the countries that don't have relations with us, they're going to be isolated. There are those who talk about boycotting Israel, will boycott them. So that's ultimately what we're looking at. And so then finally, what then do we do about the, quote, biggest security breach in history, unquote? I would say 1, vigorously practice, preserve, protect, and defend our First Amendment protected rights. Because Dr. Sabrowski is right. Jewish power, Zionist power configuration, the Israeli military intelligence is coming for us. He pointed out that South Carolina is already attempting to make that kind of speech illegal. Meanwhile, in North Carolina, Durham, the city council became the first city, I believe, to ban their police from going to train with foreign militaries with an emphasis on Israel. So that is a good opening shot in that aspect, I would say, of the American Intifada. So that is a good model. Let's let that move. Here in Kansas, a young Mennonite math teacher, she was going to be not allowed to teach math at the state level because the Kansas state legislature had passed one of these anti-BDS laws. She, with help from the ACLU, won a first round battle in the courts and pushed it back. It's going to go back to the legislature. But these represent areas for organizing. And in order to do that, we have to protect our First Amendment protected rights, which are all of them. All of them. And I believe that some aspects of the federal case that I've now filed in relationship to what I believe was my unlawful arrest 2 years ago have to do with a highly coherent and very wide violation of virtually all of the protections of the First Amendment, including petition for redress of grievance, because the person I was talking to was a former ambassador. And I've exhausted a lot of my other ways to petition my government. I've put the information in the boxes of judges, in the hands of governors, in the hands of the vice president. I've made notice of it to the head of the DOJ, and made even the president aware of it on C-SPAN, and definitely made my Congress people aware of it over time. And so, in many ways, this is all I have left, is to speak about it in public to former officials. And also, I believe religion might have been at play. The man who arrested me, who'd not only been to Israel for training, but also was working in the local fusion center, he put an anti-Jewish bias code on my trespassing charge, which was fraudulent in the first place. So I'm the wrong kind of Jew. I self-identified as a Jewish American that evening before I was arrested. So it is apparent that the entirety of the First Amendment was violated that evening. We need to protect all of them. Press rights are fundamental personal rights, as found by the Supreme Court almost 100 years ago. Number two, make boycott, divestment, and sanctions an issue of global national security and economics. I agree with Dr. Sabrowski. Things like just sort of boycotting cultural institutions. It's good for the artists and the musicians to stand up, mainly because it impacts people's education around the world. It's a good propaganda blow. But just and boycotting things like fruit or SodaStream, that's not going to cut it. We need to reach out to the military, the oath-sworn military of our country and of the world, and to point out that this is the greatest national security breach in history, and connect that to boycott, divestment, sanctions. And I, of course, am calling out Jewish Voices for Peace to make this a piece of it, as well as what some of the good work that they've started advancing around the dangerous exchange in terms of policing training in Israel. But really, I think this is where the rubber meets the road. If all groups that are putting forth boycott, divestment, sanctions won't take on the fact that Netanyahu is bragging about Israeli cyber dominance globally as front and center for the reason that we need to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, then I believe they will be proven to be frauds. Third, push hard for 9/11 truth, justice, peace, freedom, and dignity. There is some good movement here. The lawyers in Manhattan are making moves in terms of putting this into the hands of the attorney general in the Southern District of New York. I believe we need to keep putting this forward, keep organizing around 9/11 truth, justice, peace, freedom, and dignity. 9/11 truth, I believe, still remains, if we can turn it into justice, the way to unlock this entire dark scenario that's facing us here, because it involves both domestic treason in the United States at the highest levels of our so-called oath-sworn government, but also apparently organized out of the offices of Israeli military intelligence, and with the very likely major reason to help supercharge the Israeli cyber sector. And then finally, permaculturalize the Pentagon. Maybe we need something like an Eco Army Corps of Engineer version of Talpiot. And I admit it's utopian, but in a day and age of when our ecology is really on the verge, we need to transform one of the most powerful institutions in the entire world, the Pentagon, which involves, people who are very capable, who at some level are of good faith in terms of wanting to potentially protect their country, We need to turn that away from an instrument of war and away from an instrument of the worst aspects of Israeli military intelligence and into a positive force, both at home, rebuilding in our infrastructure, but also maybe abroad in terms of rebuilding our ecologies. And then finally, I don't know if I have time to read this, but I think people should look at the Justice Louis Brandeis concurrence in Whitney v. California in 1927, keeping in mind, of course, his Parushim secret Zionist secret society status. But I'm going to read this unless I hear it differently, and I'll read it very quickly. I would call this let's do speak truth diplomacy. Quote, those who won our independence believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties and that in its government, the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. They valued liberty both as an end and as a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty. They believe that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. That without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile. That with them, discussion affords ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine. That the greatest menace to freedom is an inert people. That public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of the American government. They recognized the risk to which all human institutions are subject, but they knew that order cannot be secured merely through fear of punishment for its infraction, that it is hazardous to discourage thought, hope, and imagination, that fear breeds repression, that repression breeds hate, that hate menaces stable government, that the path of safety lies in the opportunity to discuss freely supposed grievances and proposed remedies, and that the fitting remedy for evil counsels is good ones. Believing in the power of reason as applied through public discussion, they eschewed silence coerced by law, the argument of force in its worst form. Recognizing the occasional tyrannies of governing majorities, they amended the Constitution so that free speech and assembly should be guaranteed, unquote. And so this definitely should apply to our current U.S. government. I would ask those involved in our current U.S. government to listen to that. But maybe even more importantly, I would ask those involved in Jewish power networks and Israeli military intelligence, and then all those Jews around the world who support those networks to take those words of Brandeis to heart. So thank you very much. It's been an honor to be on this panel. Thank you very much to the organizers, to Kat and all of the organizers, to Alan for running the boards, and thank you, Kevin, for holding it down here. And thank you so much to my fellow co-panelists. And here are some resources I'll keep on the screen for people to look at.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy Roth-Kushel. That's an incredibly informative presentation. Very, very important. So we're now into the Q&A period. And since we don't have any panels coming after us, we can just go ahead and extend our time a little bit and try to get to as many of these questions as we can. I think we could easily go for at least another half an hour. So let's go ahead and get going. We have questions coming in from audience members. The first question is for Alan Zabrowski from Peter. And Peter says, as Alan says, the official Red Cross numbers are 300,000 total dead from Nazi concentration camps. Isn't the real denial then, denial in quotes, the willful silence, even by the Red Cross itself, of the actual verified numbers of the so-called Holocaust victims? Sounds like a rhetorical question.
Yeah, there were two studies put out by the Red Cross on this. There was a 3-volume study in 1948, which included that number. There was a second edition that came out in the 1960s, which excluded that table. And I think the difference is that one would have to look at who is funding the Red Cross and where its funds come from. I don't know. I haven't looked at it. That just occurred to me. Yeah, that would be interesting to know. But the ICRC has been remarkably silent on the entire issue. And the only reason people would be silent was because the understanding would be that the consequences for their funding, their leadership, or both would be fairly catastrophic.
Okay. I imagine that's absolutely right. Next question. I guess, Alan, you could probably take this one too, and then maybe somebody else could jump in as well. This is from Jen. And she said that, Alan, you said there's not a lot of Jewish lobby presence in China. Well, maybe not a lobby, but aren't the Israelis all over China, including stealing U.S. technology and selling it to China? Of course, Jeremy touched on some of that.
Absolutely. I think that's true. I learned a lot from listening to Jeremy. And in fact, Jeremy, are you there?
I am here.
If you wouldn't mind having a day or two with an old man, I'd love to brainstorm with you for a couple of days. I'm serious. That's a lot of information there. You have a lot of information at your fingertips. And it's an area that I don't do much work with. I mean, technology is something that let me give you an example. When it comes to cars, I turn on the ignition, I put gas in it, and anything more than that is a mystery to me. It really is. But you explained it very clearly and very coherently. And this is a very serious invitation. We'll exchange emails. Kat, we can do it through you. I'd like to work out an arrangement as soon as possible to put a day or so with you and just brainstorm. I think I'd learn a lot, and I would like to.
Me too. I think I'd learn a lot too.
And,
I want
you
to
know,
do that.
we're different fields. We're same topics. Would be good to look at that. So we'll coordinate with that. Jen, I think that's very true, but and I think that Jeremy probably would have a better handle on it. Intelligence, yes. Corporate, yes. China is in a sense, an Asia specialist of mine described China as a sponge. A gigantic sponge. It will take knowledge and information and technology from anyone. The reciprocity is not there, and China still, in fact, has a sense of its own future. I don't know the extent to which that would compromise or undercut the Israeli role, but it is certainly there. I expect China to be the great power at the end of the century. Jeremy?
And maybe,
Yeah.
maybe, okay, go ahead, Jeremy.
Well, I think that's probably very much correct in that clearly there's not the Jewish lobby is not so present in China, partially because there's not so much Jewish people in China. There's some, and it's very high level. And the exchange between Israel and China is very, very deep and very, very intense. If you look at One Belt, One Road, or the Belt Road Initiative, Israel is deep in the background in terms of providing the security for that. At the same time, I think you're correct, Dr. Sabrowski, that China takes its own security sovereignty pretty seriously, even after having given over their civilian sector communications to Verint, Israeli intelligence, basically. They now actually have created a quantum computing I think probably for the government and military sector to be able to communicate in ways that are unbreakable potentially. So that suggests what you're saying, that at some level they're not going to give the Israelis the keys to the entire kingdom, while at the same time they are in bed with people like Eric Prince, who's tied very much in through Trump and Netanyahu. Eric Prince's new company, Frontier Consulting Services, has high-level Chinese folks on the board, and they are going to be doing what they call logistics as an extension of military contracting all throughout in relationship to Belt Road, but also through Southeast Asia and then ultimately into Africa.